everyone wants to be happy in life, but everyone tends to feel the pressure of the anxious, the pressure of depression, the pressure of defeat. Man, I got stuff broken around the house I got to do. The kids need to be taken to practice. My boss is on my case. It's just like so much stuff. Oh, sweet coffee, how you ease my pain.
My precious.
But is there a way to resist? To push back against the grief and regain a sense of hope and happiness in the margins of life? I think so. Welcome to our Masterclass on Anxiety and Happiness.
How's it going there, everybody? My precious. Yes, I've got skills. All right, so welcome to our Masterclass. This is the final one. It's been a great series, but we are ending in a place that I think is very valuable and very important. And the reason for that is that I believe we have a problem, all right? And it's a strange kind of problem because as Americans, we have really managed to see engineered in our world the most ideal set of conditions for life. Like, you think about it. We have greater technology, we have greater convenience, we have access to all these things. You just go online, you order stuff, it comes in a truck right to your house. So easy, so perfect, so simple. It's like you look at all of those things, and in light of that, you go, man, we want for nothing. Like, as Americans, we should honestly rename our country Happy Land, right? Because we got it all, we're rich, we're powerful, all these things. In comparison to all of human history and the rest of the world, this is a good life. Yet, for all of that, the research tells us that Americans are the most anxious and depressed population in the world. In the world. In fact, looking at some stuff this week, they were looking at people from like second and third world countries. And those individuals have 1/5 the rate of anxiety and depression as Americans do. People in poverty are less anxious and depressed than the average American. Now, what was interesting about that is when they migrate to the United States, within just a few years, they then match us in anxiety and depression. There's something in our water, right, that kind of creates some of this. In fact, for women, the number one biggest mental health challenge is anxiety and depression in our country. Men, it's the number 2 issue. The number 1 issue for men is addiction, but most researchers think the addiction is related to self-medicating for anxiety and depression. Just this year, $300 billion will be spent on stress-related illnesses for Americans. $300 billion. Next year, 2020, they estimate that the anti-anxiety and anti-depression medication arena globally will spend $17 billion for the entire planet, but Americans will take up 20% of that amount. See, when you just start to look at all of the information, it is clear there is a problem. But I will be completely transparent and tell you I don't need the research to tell me that. I feel it. I feel it. See, this is a weird message for me because what I thought it was going to be and what it became were two different things. And again, because you know me, I love to share my life, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. This was one of those messages where God was like punching me in the face for like the 10,000th time, right? Because I have a tendency to get stressed out. I have a tendency to slide into anxiety and depression. It reminds me of something that Solomon said, where he says, with much knowledge comes much grief. And the way I have been built by God is I have a visionary gift. I'm a problem solver. But oftentimes I abuse those things and take them on myself. And the net effect of that is that I go into these places where I'm anxious, I'm fretting, I'm stressed, I'm fearful. I have this sense of kind of dread about things because I'm like, oh, it could go this way or that way. And my pessimistic nature kind of grabs hold. And I am one of those Americans where I'm like, I feel this. And yet in that, I believe God has grace, and God has tools, and God has wisdom for life that can help us in these things. And so that's going to be the nature of the day. So I'm going to go and pray for all of us today. And I want to remind you there are apps, or an app, and there's notes in the app, and there's the verses that we're going to be looking at today. But we're going to be covering some rapid ground on some important things, and that's why I want to just pray for us to set our hearts in a right space for what God's word has for us. Let's go ahead and pray together. Jesus, in all sincerity, I ask your Spirit to work in the margins of the clumsy words that I will be using today. I know that the heart is a deep well, as your word says, and I feel very inadequate to be able to speak into all the depth of people's hearts today, knowing that there are going to be hundreds of hearts that are all in different spaces than even mine, and yet that's where I ask you, Holy Spirit, to work and to guide, to teach, to show, to heal, and to help our brokenness. And so we appeal to you to do what you do so well, which is you do surgery on us. And so, Jesus, we thank you, we need you, and we praise you in your awesome name. Amen. So, you may not know this, but I'm a pastor, all right? I'm a theologian, which means I am not a physician, and I'm not a counselor, right? I want to give a little disclaimer. I say this because I want to be clear that I am speaking to a subject today that has a lot of different layers to it, and I am only technically equipped in some aspects of all those layers. And so what I don't plan to do today is try to come to this and pretend like I am a counselor that is professionally trained in that, or I am a physician and I understand those things. I am coming to you as a pastor and a theologian. And part I say that because I have heard many pastors over the course of my life speak into things that frankly they're not quite certain they know all the facts on, and then they act like they do, and they really don't, and I don't want to do that today. So I want to be really clear about that. I'm coming with some deficits and some strengths. And part of the reason I say that is because there are things that I will be sharing today that I absolutely believe these are fundamentally true. And these are so critical and important. These are things for the core of our life that we need. I'm going to be speaking to things about Jesus and the Bible and how Jesus in the Bible speaks into the challenge of our anxiety and depression and issues of happiness. Like, I think those things are absolutely critical to how we navigate life well. So I'm going to speak to that. At the same time, what I want to acknowledge is that there are additional tools and resources that sometimes we need in conjunction to Jesus in the Bible. So I'm not trying to say it's Jesus in the Bible or the other tools. What I'm saying is there are times where we need both Jesus in the Bible and some other things in our life to navigate the challenges of the topic we're looking at today. In fact, kind of breaking it out, I think when it comes to anxiety and depression, you have like 3 fundamental levels, right? The first level is just mild. It's just mild, right? And maybe that's due to uncertainty on the job, or it's a challenge with a child. Maybe you've made a decision that you know was a bad decision in life, and from that you have anxiety or you have depression. You overspent. You started dipping into a relationship you shouldn't. You said something to somebody that you know you shouldn't have said it, now it's blown up in your face. It could be any number of things. Somebody's treated you poorly, whatever it is, right? Mild level. I believe for the mild level things, at least as followers of Jesus, it's this life with Jesus and the tools that the Bible gives that can help us navigate many of those things, right? And that may be really kind of all we need, and that's fantastic. But then there's moderate level anxiety and depression. And this, I still believe, Jesus and the Bible is going to serve us well in those spaces. But you know what you also might need? You might need to go see your doctor and just run some blood work and have some tests done. Or you may need to go see a professional counselor and work through some things. In fact, years ago, after my wife had our son, she just went through all of this kind of challenge kind of emotionally, and she couldn't figure out why. It went on for months and months and months, and it was getting to this point where she's like, I don't even know myself. I'm crawling in my skin. What's going on? And she finally, through a series of events, went to the doctor and found out that she ended up with a thyroid disease from the pregnancy that was affecting all this stuff in her, and once they gave her the right medication, she was fine. And what was sad about that is that there were people in our lives that were treating it purely like a spiritual problem. You just got to pray more. You got to seek God more. You got to trust God more. And then you're like, well, what? I'm trying. I'm doing that. But I feel like I'm still struggling here. Why? And it was like, because there was a medical thing in conjunction to that. Now, do I think Jesus and the Bible helped my wife navigate that challenge? Absolutely. So I'm saying Jesus and the Bible, for sure. You want that in there. But you know what? You might need to go see your doctor. You might need a counselor. But then there's severe. And severe, you still need Jesus and you still need the Bible. But you might need a specialist. You might need therapy in some way. You might need a special program that you go into, right? PTSD, schizophrenia. There's all sorts of things. Now, here's why I give all of this disclaimer, all right? I want to be clear that in all the layers, Jesus matters. And I want to be clear that those verses that speak into our soul are absolutely critical, in my opinion, to a healthy life. Absolutely. At the same time, what I also want to be doing is to say, you know what, sometimes when you're in that moderate to extreme space, it's okay to rely on those things because for far too long as a pastor, I've interacted with Christians that really were swamped in that space, and they felt guilty. They felt guilty if they needed a treatment program. They felt guilty if they needed a therapist. They felt guilty if they needed to see their doctor and find some help, as though they're like, now it's a blight on my record. Oh, I'm not being faithful enough. I'm not trusting enough. I'm not godly enough. In fact, the church I trained in and first pastored in, they specifically would train in such a way that would say, it's just Jesus and the Bible. All these other things are dangerous to your soul. Don't trust them. I mean, it was really crazy. And then from that, people felt closeted. They felt guilty if they had to rely on anything. And I go, I just want to kind of take that out of the equation a little bit and say mental health is a real thing, right? And we need Jesus, and sometimes we need other tools. And so that's my disclaimer. I think that is important because here's the reality. The Bible is very clear. We are broken. Mind, body, soul, emotion. We're broken. Right? That's what the Bible calls the fall, right? When Adam and Eve did what they did, every part of us was affected. And sometimes that can be a bit complicated, right? So, disclaimer's done, all right? You got that in there. And hopefully from that, if you have any emails that you want to send me, it's scott@imrc.org, all right? So, he'll totally take care of it. Now, with all of that said, I want to go into what my role is. I'm the pastor, not the clinician. I'm not a physician. I'm a pastor. But in that, I'm also a pastor who struggles with the topic of the day. And so here's what I want to start off by saying. I believe something in my bones that's absolutely true. It's why it's in part the mission statement of our church. I believe that life is better with Jesus. I absolutely believe that, 100%. And when I say that, what I'm saying in part is that I believe my anxious life is better with Jesus. What I'm saying is my depressed life is better with Jesus. When I am anxious or I am discouraged and Jesus is in my boat, I'm in way better shape than when I kick Jesus out of the boat. When I'm anxious or discouraged or depressed and Jesus isn't there, it is worse. And it gets worse. When Jesus is in there, man, there is hope and there is healing and there is strength. But then to really get to that space, what I need to do is I need to start looking at the world then, not through my own eyes, but I need to learn to look at the world through his eyes. And when I look at the world through his eyes, it causes me to confront my own vision of things. So for example, here's how I want to try to break this down. Throughout the series, we've been looking at different topics, right? We looked at marriage and communication, sex, parenting, money, and work. And those things, those 6 areas, I think take up the majority of our lives, right? Like honestly, if you were to parse out the amount of time in your life given to those things, that's pretty much all your time. And those things also consume a lot of your emotion, a lot of your mental kind of energy and focus and everything else. So that's pretty central. And if I took those different things and I was to ask almost any American, anybody in this room, what is it you want out of these things? You're going to say happiness. Ultimately, and that's not a bad answer, right? Happiness is a totally logical answer. I want a happy marriage. I want happy kids. I want communication that is happy between me and my spouse and others. I want to be happy when it comes to my finances, and I want a job that I find happy and fulfilling and rewarding. I mean, that is a natural thing that we are going to want to seek. Here's the challenge I am concluding on happiness, right? Happiness, ultimately, if you boil it down, is this state of things that we envision as an ideal. So we go, here's what I want. It's up here. Like, my job's here, but I want a happy job. I want happy marriage. I want happy kids with happy money. So we want that. So we envision this target or this thing. And so happiness then becomes when my dreams are fulfilled in reality. Now, here's the thing about this. I think that happiness, because we set it at a certain spot, may be the actual root of our anxiety. It may, in fact, be the root of some of our discouragement and our depression. So just as much as we go, man, I want happiness in those areas, we tend to find anxiety in a lot of these areas. We get anxious about our kids. We get anxious about our money. We get anxious about our job because we've said, I want it to be here. But often it's here, and it feels like it's going to go here, right? So it's the very quest for what we want that seems to be the very thing that derails us and takes us into these places. In fact, in part, I think this is why maybe Americans struggle with this so much, because we actually think happiness can be accomplished. Most cultures don't. Right? Most cultures go, no, we're poor. Life's hard. We get it. This is the median average. But for us, we're bombarded all the time on social media with, here's my happy life. Are you as happy as me? Like, no. We get commercials. Are you depressed? Are you sad? Are you alone? Yes. Here's a medication. Here's a website. Here's a person. Here's an item. Here's a thing. Right? Like, we actually go like, hey, I could be happy, but I don't seem to always be happy. What's the problem? And from that, we feel anxious or sad or discouraged, right? And so happiness may be the very thing that creates the anxiety. In fact, to diagram this out, I want to kind of help us a little bit to understand what anxiety is. And by the way, from here on out, when I say anxiety, I'm also wrapping into their depression, discouragement, those kinds of things. They all have a relationship. They can be parsed out differently in clinical elements, but for today, this is kind of the way I'm looking at it, right? So let's see if we can understand how this tends to work. In life, we go, I want something. What I want is whatever it is, right? And then we have any number of things that we want. And if we get what we want, then we have happiness, right? Because I received what I wanted. I get what I wanted. It makes perfect sense, and that's why we can be happy. But then if we don't get what we wanted, we're sad, right? Because it didn't come through. Now, we're mad if somebody keeps us from getting what we wanted, right? And so, for example, today if the Seahawks win, I'll be happy, right? And if somebody doesn't get into the college they wanted to get into, they're sad, right? And if somebody scratches your car and doesn't leave a note, you're mad, right? But here's the thing about all of those categories. They exist in the after effect. In other words, whether you're sad or mad or happy, it's because it's concluded, and that's your emotion from a conclusion. How's anxiety different? Anxiety is different because you're not sure where it's going to go. It might do this or it might do that. And it is the variable of it not having concluded yet. You don't know how life is going to turn out. You don't know if you're going to have that job or not, have that money or not, have that relationship or not, have your kid turn out well or poorly. That whole variable, that is madness for us. And that is what creates this anxious thing. See, anxious haunts us. It haunts us because we just don't know, right? And that lack of knowing, it freaks us out, right? But that lack of knowing, that wondering is measured against, but I want to be happy. I want my happiness, and I'm not sure I will get my happiness. So now I'm anxious. In fact, as I was trying to work this through this week, I'm like, how do I define this? And so this was the conclusion I came to just from my own life. This was analysis. I'm like, what's my thing? What drives me so often in this, right? Anxiety is a distractedness of heart due to my inability to guarantee an outcome of happiness. I'm going to say that again. Anxiety is a distractedness of heart due to my inability to guarantee an outcome of happiness. And notice the letter at the middle of those words. I've got to worry about this now. I've got to figure this out. I'm scared. I'm not certain. I put it all on me. I've got to keep working this through till I come up with a way through the minefield. And so now it's constantly me trying to play the role of God, right? I'm trying to ensure a future for my happiness, and I'm distracted by that. And the more I'm trying to solve the problem, the more I'm worrying about the issues, the more I'm fretting about whatever, the more I spiral down and down into this problem. And you know what that is? That's exhausting. It's exhausting. Solomon said as much. He says, a glad heart makes a cheerful face, but by sorrow of heart, the spirit is crushed. So you know what I dig about Solomon here? He knows the problem's real. He knows the problem's real, right? Now, it may be, again, self-inflicted for any number of reasons. I think oftentimes what's self-inflicted is expectation, right? We just expect, we hope, we want something ideal, and we fear that we won't have it, or we see it's coming apart, or maybe we're living in the middle of it not occurring, and from that, man, we are sorrowful of heart, but it's still a real problem. And see, I believe the way to sort of push against the pull of uncertainty is not some of the things that we do. See, here's one thing I think I try to do. I feel like I start to go under in uncertainty, and you know what I want to do? I try to remove the uncertainty. Like, how do I come up with a great engineered plan to make things certain? That's cute, right? Like, honestly, it's above my pay grade. I can't make anything certain, but that's what I want to do. So then I drive myself a little bit more crazy by trying to make the uncertain certain, but I don't think that's the way we should do it. Another thing we try to do is we try to figure out a way to then banish anything that could be anxious in our lives. But you can't just simply banish anxiousness by trying to eradicate it in some way. Or we say, no, I'm just going to pursue more things for my happiness. But the problem there, again, is happiness can be elusive. And the more you try to get happiness, the more you will struggle sometimes to sense happiness. So the question becomes, how do we solve the issue, right? Well, here's the thing I do know. It's a fool's errand to try to control life, which is all I think I'm trying to do when I start to get into those places. I'm just trying to control life. But rather than trying to control life, I believe what the Bible says is we need to seek God to work in the conditions, not of my life as much as work in the condition of my heart. See, this is a heart issue more than it's anything else. It's not circumstantial. It's internal, right? It's something that's in me. Again, what did Proverbs 15 say? Gladness of heart, sorrow of heart. The commonality is the heart. This is why Solomon tells his son early on, he says, son, keep your heart with all vigilance. Keep your heart, because that is going to be from which you live your life. It will define your life. In other words, the condition of your heart will shape your vision for how you see life. And when he says keep your heart, he is not saying to us, hey, get control of your heart, right? Wrestle that thing to the ground. You got to get some like spurs and drive that thing. That's not what he's saying. When he says keep your heart, what he's saying is take steps to protect it. That's what he's saying. You have to protect your heart. Try to keep out the unwanted things that will create for you turmoil, fear, envy, greed, want, control, power. It's all idolatry. Keep out the stuff that makes you think you have to be in charge to make it work. Like he says, keep that out. Protect the heart from those contaminants. See, if anything, I would say what we're talking about here is taking steps toward preventative medicine of the soul. And what that's going to mean, by the way, is the stuff that I want to share today is not simply, oh, when I feel like life is spiraling out of control, I better do these things. That's what I tend to do. It's not as effective as always seeking to do these things so that when those times come, you are healthier and ready for it. See, this should be stuff that's in us all the time so that when those times come, we then more drive forward in these principles. But these principles should always be true of our lives. And so from this, because we live from our interior, because the heart matters and we want to have some preventative medicine so we can deal with those seasons when they come well, what we want to do is we want to optimize the heart for greater health. And to do this, I'm going to plant my feet in a passage that I think is most valuable. Now, again, in my just transparency with you, the passage we are going to mostly plant our feet in is not my favorite passage. It's just not. I have a lot of other favorite passages, favorite sections of the Bible, but this passage I find is the most important one for me. In other words, it is the passage I probably go to the most because I fall victim to discouragement so often. Right? Like, I kind of know, like, I'm in there, and now what's the solution? It's always this passage is the solution to dig me out, right? To start bailing the water out of my sinking boat. So it's weird that the most important passage for me probably isn't my favorite, but it's probably because it's also constantly confronting my challenge, right? So what's the passage that I go to bail me out in the realm of anxiety and depression and discouragement? Well, it's found in Philippians chapter 4, probably the same one that a lot of you go to. Philippians chapter 4. Here's our friend Paul. He's incarcerated. He's been betrayed by friends. He's being slandered so that his life is made more miserable. And more than once in this little letter of 4 chapters, he has said, I'm not sure about the future. I'm not certain where this is going. I don't know if I'm going to live or die, and even which side of that fence I want to be on right now. Like, honestly, his whole future was completely uncertain. The same thing that we feel when we get anxious or we get depressed. When we come out of this, will it be okay? Is it going to be all right? He's in the same space. So his life is prime conditions for anxiety and depression. And yet, here's what he says. He says, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say, rejoice. Now, can I tell you why this is cool? He does not say, hey, feel joy. You ever been depressed and discouraged and somebody says, hey, man, just be happy. Yeah, I'm going to punch you in the face, right? Because I can't just turn it on. That's the worst thing about emotions, right? I can't just flip it. Oh, I'm happy now, woohoo, right? In fact, this is why, like I said, men, when they're discouraged or anxious, they medicate. Because they're trying to tap into just a window of happy. But it's not real happy. You just can't just turn it on. But Paul doesn't say feel joy. He says act out that thing that looks like joy. Act out that thing that looks like joy. So what he's saying is when you start to feel like you want to worry or wallow or weep, rebel against that by rejoicing. Do this activity that says, no, I'm not going to do it. And you know what? You might have to rejoice through your tears. You might have to rejoice through your worry. It's like it's this thing coming at you, and you're just going to stiff arm it as you rejoice, right? Like that becomes this thing that he encourages. And it's not, hey, rejoice in your problem. No, he says, rejoice in the Lord who is with you in your problem. That is different. People will say that, well, you say I'm supposed to rejoice when I lost my job. No, I'm saying you rejoice in the Lord when you lost your job. Because the Lord is with you. I think about that in the story of Joseph back in the Old Testament, right? Joseph's life totally falls apart. And he's in prison and he's falsely accused and all this stuff happens. And throughout the story, you see this one little line, and the Lord was with Joseph. And the Lord was with Joseph. And the Lord was with Joseph. Do you know what's interesting about the story of Joseph? There's never a recorded element ever where God audibly spoke to Joseph. I was going, everybody in the Old Testament heard from God audibly. No, not Joseph, right? God was with them in silent, but he was with them. And yet he rejoiced in his Lord throughout his story, and we need to do the same thing, right? We need to do the same thing. Rejoice in the Lord as we face the problem. See, I was thinking about this with my own life. In those times, when I start to feel this little creature crawl up my back, right? Little tentacles of anxiety and discouragement, depression come creeping in. I tend to, if I'm not on top of it with Jesus, I tend to tumble in on myself, right? That goes back to that whole I become the center of my anxiety. I become the center of my happiness. I need to accomplish this because I'm feeling that. And so I worry and I doubt and I try to process and all this stuff. And the more I do that, the more I'm increasing the pressure of my life. I fill with pressure because it's on me. And so I feel the pressure to solve it. But when I stop and I rebel by rejoicing, you know what that does? It releases a pressure valve. Because your brain, it's hard to do multiple things at once. I know for you women, you're way better at this than men, so maybe women are like, no, you don't even know what it's like to multitask. I agree, but there is something about this thing where I'm feeling kind of the, and I get in my car and I just start fighting to rejoice. Right? I just start praising God. I lock onto some song that I learned in junior high about the goodness of God, and I just start singing it and reminding myself, it's like, that is rebellion, man. I'm gonna fight against this beast that's trying to get me right now. Paul knows this to be true. God knows it to be true. There's something about choosing to rejoice, fulfilling that command that, man, that vents the pressure. And so maybe for you, it's a prayer, or it's journaling, or it's just celebrating God to the top of your lungs. I don't know what your thing is, but I know that it vents the pressure. And Paul knows this. So he says, rejoice. And again, I say, rejoice. It's an act of defiance against despair. Then he says the second thing. He says, don't be anxious about anything. Right. This is an interesting one to me. And here's the thing, and I know I'm a little bit of a strange duck, maybe because I have read the Bible so often, I tend to read it and ask the question, what's the tone of a statement? Right? That's the hardest thing about things that are written, right? You don't get the inflection. And so I'm always like, what's the tone here? Is he saying, like, don't worry about it, right? No biggie. Forget about it. Like, is that, or is he saying, don't you dare be anxious? Like, is he mean dad, sweet dad? Is it encouragement? Is it a command? Is it a call to action? Like, what is this? That begs the question for me. Well, as I was trying to work this through this week, one of the things I found interesting is that this word anxious, if you did a word search, comes up very little. It's not a ton of places in the Bible. I think it talks about anxiety a lot, but it doesn't use the word a lot. And so I'm like, man, okay, where else does it occur? It comes up very little, but one of the places that is most interesting to me is Jesus talks about it. In Matthew chapter 6, he says, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life. Which of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life? So Jesus says it and Paul says it. And I believe Paul is saying it because he knows Jesus has spoken to this. And I believe that when I couple the two together and I try to understand the heart behind this, I believe it's less this statement that says, don't fall into anxiety. Don't fall into the anxious sin. I don't think it's don't fall into the sin of anxiousness. I don't think that's the tone. I believe the tone is more don't persist in the cycle of anxiousness for the very reason that it breeds more anxiousness. It's a spiral case down. And so it's like, man, you want to do whatever you can do to jam something into the cycle now so that you don't keep getting deeper and deeper into it. So don't persist in it is more, I think, the tone than simply don't fall into the sin of it. And see, I think this is brilliant on the part of Jesus, right? I think it's brilliant. Because here's what at least I think is true of me. Because it's an uncertainty out here in the future. And I go, man, in 2 years, this could be a thing. And because this could be a thing in 2 years or 1 year or 6 months or whatever it is, I begin to, again, work through all of the challenges. And I begin to worry, what if it goes bad? And what will we do here? And what will we do there? And what would that look like? And I don't even know. And all this stuff. And I'm trying to work through all the scenarios. And I'm fretting about all this stuff. And I'm doing that right now, basically ruining my life today about a fear that my life will be ruined in the future. And Jesus says, so in other words, Matt, what you're doing is you're trying to guarantee a quality of life and time in the future at the cost of quality of life and time now. You're trying to add a better future tomorrow by worrying today. How does that add a better future tomorrow? He says, you're not going to add a single hour to your lifespan doing that, Matt. All your worry is just double dipping despair. Like that future could come and be bad. But you worried all the way up to that future. Didn't that help? Was that more beneficial? Did that encourage you, Matt? Were you more ready for that future because you worried all the way up to that future? Jesus is like, do yourself a favor, man. It'll be tough enough when you get there, right? Don't saddle yourself with a bunch of other stuff and then get there and you're not ready for that. It just pulls you under. See, so that's why I think Jesus is brilliant here. And so what Jesus knows is it's a heart issue and it's a trust issue and it's a lean into God issue more than me trying to change the conditions of my surroundings or change the future in some way. It's just trusting God as I move forward. And the proof of this to me is Jesus himself. Right? This to me is probably one of the most profound things just in my own personal life. I'm not saying it's going to be profound for you, but it's profound for me on the topic. So Jesus has just been with his disciples. He's washed their feet. He's poured into them. They've had a final meal together. He is now in a garden, and he is going to God. What's interesting about the garden that Jesus goes to, I'm convinced that in that garden, that's where his soul was crucified. The cross was where his body was crucified. But I believe when he's praying in that garden, there you see a soul being crucified. And so he's in this space, and he's praying to God, and he prays this: my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Have you ever been so anxious and discouraged? You're like, you know what? That telephone pole on the side of the road right now would do me well. If my heart stopped, I would be okay. If this was my last breath, I'm ready for that. Like, that is a weight of pain and hurt that's deep, and Jesus is sorrowful unto death. I mean, that is a strong statement. So he says, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And he has this iteration of prayer 3 times. And in the context of this, it says, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. So that's in the Gospel of Luke. And so we're kind of coupling these things together. I just want to stop right now, and I want to give us some encouragements. The first thing is this. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 2 to chapter 4, it says that Jesus sympathizes with our weaknesses. I want you to look at this, and I want you to understand that Jesus sympathizes with your anxiety, your fear, your discouragement, and your dread. He's showing you that he went through it too. So when you go, I don't know if God cares. God's like, I cared so much I came into the world and I experienced it. I care. I'm with you in your dread. The second thing, and this bounced out to me actually this morning. Like, I'd worked on this week, but this morning I'm just kind of looking over all this stuff, and I go, okay, this is so weird. Jesus is on a journey in the story, right? It's a process. So here's the thing. He prays, God, I'm hurting. Take this from me. And guess what? It gets worse. So he prays the second time, God, I'm hurting. Take this from me. And it gets even worse. And then a third time, God, I'm hurt. Like, do you, here's our thing. God, I came to you. I'm hurting. Now why is it worse? I don't know why it's worse, but I know Jesus is feeling greater strain and pressure with every iteration of his prayer. But then notice how he is confronting his agony of the soul. He says, I'm in dread. God, if there's a way to produce a future that is like this, that would be great. But God, I would rather have your future than mine. Right? Hey, I would love this future. But God, I know you are good. And I'd rather have the future you have for me than the future I want. My future, here's my happy. But if I stay with my happy future and it doesn't happen, I will be miserable, God. Like, that is not his prayer. He's like, God, I would love to not go to the cross, but your future's better than anything else. Like, the more we can own that and make that our prayer, the better off we're going to be. So it's not just, hey, give me my future, end of story. It's, God, ultimately give me the future you want me to have and help me to receive it. Now, what's interesting to me in the story is what happens next. By the end of his prayer time, it says, when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples. And that idea of when he rose from prayer, there's this new resolve. After pain, even more pain, he comes out of that and he rises. There's like this sense of, okay, this is now, I'm accepting God's future for me. Whatever that might look like in our lives, it's that same sense of resolve. Like, okay, God's got a better plan than I do. And so Jesus rises from his prayer and he comes to the disciples and he finds them, it says, sleeping for sorrow. Or literally, maybe a better translation in the New Living, I think they capture it well, asleep, exhausted from grief. And he said to them, why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. Here's what's interesting here. Jesus, in his anxiety and discouragement, prays and keeps pressing through. These guys, they're asleep, they're exhausted from their sorrow. In other words, they pulled a Matt Boswell, where I go to bed, and instead of praying out my pain, I just start processing my pain until I'm exhausted. They just process the fact that, man, things aren't looking good. Something's the matter. It's not looking bright. And they just keep working it over and over and over. And so Jesus says, what are you doing? What you trying to sleep off the potential of a hard future? No, you want to pray. You don't want to enter into the temptation of all of that stuff that is baggage. You want to work this out. So there's a contrast. He rises out of the battle ready. They are swamped in their anxiety and their discouragement. And it's a lesson, right? They're all going to face a tough future, right? Like in minutes, dudes are going to show up. And Jesus is going to go willingly and confidently in whatever future God has for him. These guys run and they hide and then they beat themselves up over their failure. They weren't ready because they just focused on the problem and didn't focus on the God who holds their future, right? So, difference of story. With that, I take us back to Philippians chapter 4. I'm going to speed this up here. Paul said what? Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. See, this is so good because we go, well, what's the command? Don't be anxious? No, the command is, but in everything. Man, in everything, we want to bring prayer and supplication as request, right? And thanksgiving. So here's the thing I dig about this, man. Like when you feel those times coming, this is what you want to go full tilt King David prayer life, man. Right? You're just pouring out your heart. You're being honest in it. God, I'm worried. God, I'm stressed. God, I'm down. God, I'm uncertain. God, this isn't fair. Why is this happening? This is not the script I wrote for my life. But you have to then pivot into, and I will be thankful anyway. And I will thank you for you did this and you did that. And I thank you that you have my future. And you care about me more than I care about me. And you love my kids more than I love my kids. And eternity is a much longer time than just the next couple of years. And man, the list could go on and on and on. But you want to lean into thankful. If it's just God change my future, but we don't stop and we're thankful, we're missing part of the formulaic nature of this whole thing, right? Because it all fits together. So it should be, here's my need, here's my want, but thank you that you know best. Thank you that you are always in control. And so we have prayer, resistance, thankfulness. And we're doing all of that, not simply like to get God to act on my behalf. But rather, I think it's this idea of seeking to ask God to come and secure my heart when I am sort of beside myself, right? It's like, God, I need you to anchor this in here. I don't know what the conditions will be like, but if you anchor the stuff in here, the conditions won't have the same power. And so anchor me inside. In fact, I love the way Paul kind of lays this out. He says, rebel by rejoicing, right? And he says, pray, ask, thank. And from that, verse 7, and the peace of God. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. What did we say at the beginning? The heart is the issue. What did Solomon say? Guard your heart. And then here's what we see here. By doing these things, that invites the peace of God to guard our heart. So when you read Solomon, you're like, I guard my heart. How do I guard my heart? Paul's like, let me follow that one up for you. Here's what you do to guard your heart. And you got to do this all the time, right? All the time. And then he doubles down. He says, finally, brothers, whatever's true and honorable and just and pure and lovely, commendable, if there's anything excellent, and is there anything worthy of praise, think about these things, practice those things, and the God of peace will be with you. So he's like, man, you want to lean into what is true and helpful and strong. Don't give into the stuff or the sins or the attitudes that breed fear and dread and contempt and frustration and anger and anxiety. Like, don't think on those things. Focus on, seek out, and remind yourself of the list of qualities that are right here. See, it's not trying to go after happiness. It's not trying to banish anxiousness, but rather what we need, and we see here, is we need peace. Peace is the target. In Proverbs 14, it says, a peaceful heart leads to a healthy body. But envy is like a cancer in the bones. It is so true. I went to the doctor for all of these health problems, to which I found out it's stress problems. Like Solomon knew thousands of years ago, like, yeah, when you're all feeling cruddy, it oftentimes is an internal issue. So here's the thing I walked away with from this week. If I want to be happy, here's the key. I should not aim for happy. And if I want to minimize anxiety, you know what my target is? I need to focus more on anxiety. Right? What I see here is something that both the Old and New Testament says. Seek peace and pursue it. Seek peace and pursue it. And the God of peace is the solution. Paul continues to go in Philippians here. He says, I have learned in whatever situation that I am to be content, and I've learned how to do that. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. Do you catch that? That is one of the coolest things to me. God of peace can secure you. I've learned to be content. I can do all things through Christ. By the way, I'm still in trouble. I'm still in trouble. But you know what? That he had trouble did not mean he was troubled by his trouble. Because he could do all things through Christ. So here's the bottom line. If we want to increase the conditions for health or healthy happiness and decrease the weight of anxious thought, we should not focus on trying to be more happy and not be anxious. Rather, we need to focus on trust in God by seeking the peace of God so as to fortify the heart with God. Let's pray together. Jesus, I thank you that you secure us. And I thank you that you give us resource to rely on you. And I know in my own life, probably the biggest challenge is simply relentlessly pursuing that which you offer. I either quit too early or I don't begin to begin with, right? And so may we be faithful to you and press into you and your grace. We love you and thank you in your name. Amen.